Okay, thank you for joining us, Emily, and the St. Francis group. So our process, our project, we were at Maple Ave and we interviewed roughly 10 to 12 people. We did a couple interviews with Emily. We toured the building and continued to ask questions about just the church and the church life within the building. And between attending services, watching online, went to the food distribution, and there's a book on Maple Ave's history. We looked through consistory minutes and the website. So through these different things and our process of ethnography, we were just searching the heart of what makes up Maple Ave. We looked at the different strands and the different things that make up Maple Ave, the initiatives they have, ministries they do, what their language is, what their leadership goals and priorities are. And through that, we discussed and put together this presentation about what we experienced and saw through this process to be Maple Avenue Ministries.
Okay. As we went through all of these different modes of interacting with Maple Avenue, the metaphor that we landed on that felt like a fit to describe Maple Avenue is that of a mother. And so as we go through this presentation, it might be helpful to kind of use this as a lens and kind of imagine Maple Avenue as a busy, harried mom with many young kids, a mom who maybe is an adoptive or foster mom who has just opened her arms wide and welcomed in a lot of different kids. And because of just this full house and lots of different kinds of people and lots of needs, the budget's tight and the house is run down, and sometimes life feels stressful and chaotic. And maybe we can think of her as a single mom feeling unsupported by those maybe she ought to be able to depend on to support her, maybe sometimes feeling alone in the denomination or in the city of Holland, feeling very different and maybe single in that sense. There's a degree of longing or lament, maybe a sense that here we are, the bride of Christ, partnering with the King in kingdom work, and it would be so wonderful if we could have a more tangible experience of the groom alongside us, but it can be a lonely experience that causes lament. And then this mother, part of what makes her safe and welcoming to the children that come to her is partly because she's real and doesn't have it all together, and has opened her home in this way that creates a little bit of chaos or frazzledness sometimes, but it's part of the beauty of who she is. And so that's just a picture that we want to suggest and maybe to keep in mind as we engage the other parts of this presentation.
And now for just a brief moment, we're going to take some time to gather around the word of the Lord as it comes to us in the Gospel of Matthew. So hear the word of the Lord. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. And blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. And so as we considered the stories of Maple Avenue in light of God's word, we discerned that the Beatitudes are actually a very fitting way to frame your life over at Maple Avenue. Each Beatitude seemed to bear witness to a true aspect of your identity. And so rather than come up with our own structure, as we share with you, we're trying to let the Beatitudes be one way to tell the story of Maple Avenue. One of the significant parts of that is through asking good questions based on the stories that we've heard. So each Beatitude in this presentation will be paired with some brief reflections and a question. And it's our hope that you would receive all this as a gift. So we can go on to the next slide.
The first beatitude is, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And the poor in spirit are those who understand that their power comes from God. Their only strength and direction is from the Lord. And at Maple Avenue, and we could sense through our interviews and through our research that the poor in spirit at Maple Ave know that their power is in prayer. In some of our interviews, we saw that a number of people found one of the ways to be involved and to be a part of the community at Maple Ave was through smaller or intimate prayer groups in which they would bring their heart, their confessions before the Lord together in community, and would call upon God to come down and be their strength and their source of power. Another was in disagreements. In an interview, I spoke with someone. She said that when there's a disagreement, what folks at Maple Ave often do is they go to their individual prayer closet and they pray it out. And then they come back and they take care of what they need to take care of. And I saw this as a beautiful image of being poor in spirit, of recognizing that it's truly God where we get our direction, especially in times of conflict. And there was another disagreement that was mentioned when there was a consistory meeting and feelings were hurt, tensions were high, and as something happened, they weren't quite sure what to do. So they broke out in prayer. And that was the direction they took. So they could tell that their power came from God. Specifically, there were some prayer warriors. In a slide in your church, it speaks to the nature of prayer that you have. It said, pray bold prayers for these things. Your congregation is encouraged to pray bold prayers for injustices in Holland, for people in your community, your church community who need care, who need the power of God to come upon them. But apart from inviting everyone, there's individual people who I just get the sense that their spirit and their breath almost is prayer. Everything about them is a prayer. And there were people in our interviews that mentioned some of these people, and they said that they taught us about prayer. And these folks speak to how Maple Ave finds their power in prayer. And 3 of your identities, called to the core city, centered in Christ and committed to reconciliation, come through in prayer as well in stories that we uncovered. One of them was there was a prayer march that lasted hours through the community, and they would walk around the different places. And as you're called to the core city, and to be reconciling agents and bring the life of Christ there, you are bringing your power, which is in prayer, literally walking through. Another story was when a family from the community, the neighborhood, came in and they were desperate. And what they asked, they came to you for prayer. So in these ways, we can sense that prayer is a vehicle that fuels your mission and gives you power. And then a question for you all to consider as you're going forward with your 3 C's. How is a prophetic vision at Maple Ave finding birth and new life through intercessory prayer? In what ways do you use it as an engine, prayer as an engine for your mission?
There we go. So the next beatitude is, blessed are those who mourn. And we've done this with a couple of the slides, kind of separated out how Maple Avenue embodies this beatitude, and then how Maple Avenue ministers to people who experience this. So we would say Maple Avenue is those who mourn, in the sense that there is grief in the prophetic awareness of racism, privilege, and the need for reconciliation. So as you as a church continually commit yourselves to identifying with the marginalized and downtrodden, you experience the grief of those communities as your own. And then there's also some mourning and grief in relation to your uniqueness as a church within Holland, and within the RCA and CRC. And you minister in a way that most churches within those denominations could only dream of, but with far fewer resources and sometimes the support of the wider community feels really inadequate. And then, of course, you're currently walking through a season of grief with the marital separation of Pastor Denise and CJ, and no longer having CJ among you. And so that's something that the whole church family is experiencing together as a shared season of mourning. Maple Avenue also ministers to those who mourn. A recent example would be when Pastor Denise was called on to provide pastoral care, and Maple Avenue hosted the funeral for Troy T.J. Wells, who was the 14-year-old who was killed through gun violence. And this really points to the way that Pastor Denise is recognized as a pastor for the wider community. There was a quote from one of our interviewees that before the funeral, there was just an informal kind of small gathering of people at Maple Avenue, I think, to pray. And this individual that we interviewed said, Christ was there with us, comforting and encouraging us. This presence of Maple Avenue with those who mourn seems to be part of the way Maple Avenue is called to the core city. It seems to be part of how that is lived out, is being there for people in times of grief and loss. And then within the family, another quote that we have is someone said that when her mother passed away, Pastor Denise and CJ's presence was especially meaningful to her. So there is a coming alongside in the midst of mourning that's really valuable and that is noticed. A question to consider going forward as it pertains to this beatitude is, how is the current mourning and desire for comfort moving the family into the presence of those who mourn in the broader community? Oh, this is me again. So, and then blessed are the meek. So meekness can be a little bit difficult to define. And so here we're going to focus on the ways that meekness can mean a chosen gentleness or an experience of powerlessness. And those two things, it can be both and. Maple Avenue demonstrates meekness through authenticity. Throughout our interviews, we heard again and again that Maple Avenue is real, raw, authentic, that there isn't a facade or an image that's being maintained. And this authenticity and even imperfections cause people to feel safe. There's a warmth and an openness, a willingness to be real, to be vulnerable, and not to present a polished image. Maple Avenue also ministers to the meek, to the gentle, the unassuming, the unimpressive, the powerless. And we want to highlight a couple of examples of how that takes place. The way that children are treated and welcomed at Maple Avenue is really noteworthy and came up numerous times throughout our interviews. Some of our interviewees mentioned the open table for communion and the way that children are welcomed to the table and feel safe and at home there. Others mentioned the way that children are just allowed to be themselves even in the services, and that the noise and chaos that they create is something that there's space and welcome made for that. And that's a very unique part of life at Maple Avenue. We also heard from interviewees that there's a commitment among the community at Maple Avenue to live authentically and vulnerably with each other in community. So this, in other words, this authenticity isn't something that just shows up from leaders or from the front or during services, but it seems to be a commitment that's held among the church body. So one of the quotes that demonstrates that is someone said, "We are here to stick it out, to learn, to communicate and correct our mistakes, to call things out when we see them." And this demonstrates the outworking of the committed to reconciliation value that Maple Avenue has. It's a way that that works out within the family life. Another way that Maple Avenue ministers to the meek, and this doesn't really show up on the slides, but is that Maple Avenue seems to minister alongside the community. And it's not this sense of sort of coming in from the outside and doing ministry to the community, but it's rather a sense of coming alongside from within and doing ministry with the community, which is a way that Maple Avenue is meek in their presence in the neighborhood. I think the years of Mac Rec would be an example of this, and the desire of people to get that back up and running who were kids who came up through Mac Rec themselves. That's a unique and beautiful part of Maple Avenue. So a question going forward is, how might Maple Avenue's meekness, both the intentional gentleness and humility, as well as the painful powerlessness in having less resources than others, position you to minister to those who often feel invisible and powerless in Holland?
What we've seen at Maple Avenue is a deep hunger and thirst to know and experience God. And this is, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. If it's in the bread, in the wine, in song, in prayer, laments, or celebration, as Maple Avenue gathers around Scripture, your hunger and thirst for righteousness has been on display. for us. Gathering together in corporate worship to us seems to be the center of your congregational life, even in COVID times. Specifically, Jesus' presence by his Spirit in the waters of baptism and at the table seems to animate Maple Avenue, and in that way it is God who satisfies your hunger and thirsts. Here's what one of you said about Sunday mornings. I would say that you've got to come about 8 times to get Maple Avenue Ministries. Every week is a bit of a meal, and you might get nurtured through liturgy one week, singing the other, teaching the other. You've got to come a few times and sit in it, trying to more than just entertain you, trying to feed you. Maple Avenue also ministers to those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. And what I mean by that is that Maple Ave attends to the hungers and thirsts of the broader community. We've already been talking about ways this happens, and we'll continue to talk about that in the coming slides. But here's what one of you said about how worship is central to this work as well. The liturgy is always dialed in to what's going on in the community, what's going on in the nation. The liturgy addresses the questions, longings, and thanksgivings of our world before God. So worship moves the community to hunger and thirst, to the hunger and thirst of those around you. And this rings true with one of your 3 C's, committed to the core city. Called to the core city, not committed. And it's not just called to your church at Maple Avenue, but in a special way to a section of the world in Holland, Michigan, between 12th and 22nd Streets, College and Van Raalte. So with all this in mind, here's a question going forward. How does Sunday morning provide rest and nourishment for your journey as you live out Mamley's mission Monday through Saturday with those who continue to hunger and thirst? Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. As we paid attention to your community, another image that presented itself was Maple Avenue as a deacon. The traditional role of the deacon is to carry out the ministry of mercy on behalf of the church as the hands and feet of Christ. And in part, it was a quote from one of you that helped us notice this image. They said, "People came up to me and were there for me. At Maple Avenue, if you have questions about anything or need anything, ask, and a ton of people will be at your door." Just a few of the many ways you do this, meeting the needs of the people in Flint as a result of the water crisis that is ongoing, offering food to the neighbors in your community by gathering in the parking lot and meeting people, and giving them food, even facilitating the meeting of other needs via crowdsourcing. And I'm thinking right now specifically of what I see on Pastor Denise's Facebook page. Literally just noticing that there is a need and saying, does anybody have this? Because we have a need that we need to meet. If it's transportation, childcare, employment, clothing, food, financial support, or anything else, there seems to be a sort of hive mind approach to the acts of mercy in the people of Maple Avenue. Here's another quote from one of you that to me sounds a lot like "Blessed are the merciful." There's a graciousness that characterizes the community, a strong core of people willing to engage the raw, messy experience of being community. And a question going forward. In a world of violence, pain, and suffering, how is Maple Avenue Ministries offering mercy, not judgment, inclusion, not canceling?
I've never seen this happen. I guess the picture didn't load. We'll just have to live without the picture.
So our next beatitude is blessed are the pure in heart. And at Maple Avenue, your prophetic spirit calls your church and the community itself to be pure in heart. And one of the ways that you do that is through preaching. a person said that how they experience preaching at Maple Avenue is it's inviting and it's extending, and they're able to feel the presence of God. In a recent sermon from Pastor Denise titled Peace Be With You, she talked about the peace of this world and how the peace of this world and the peace of Christ are two different things. And with that, reminded me of was Genesis chapter 1, when God created the earth. In Genesis 1 verse 2, the earth was formless and void, it said, or there was chaos. But then Genesis 1 verse 2b in Hebrew says, Haruach Elohim merehefet al panei hamayim, which means the spirit or the breath of the Lord hovered over the face of the deep or over the chaos. And then what came after that, came after the chaos, was let there be light, which is what a prophetic voice does. It enters chaos. The spirit of the Lord or the breath hovers over the waters of chaos, and then it brings light. One of, in your prophetic presence and imagination, you have a central role of it is through children. And I can't think of a better verse to describe it than Psalm 8, verse 2, is out of the infants and babes you have called forth praise. You've called forth praise to silence the foe and the avenger. And if it's in worship or other places, children are constantly involved, constantly speaking the word of the Lord. And for me, one of the most profound ways I saw it was when I attended the Black Lives Matter March. And before it, they were singing on June 7, 2020, after George Floyd had been murdered, they were singing, "We Shall Overcome." And it brought me to a place that, as a white person, I have always admired, but I was humbled to be brought into this setting to experience that. And then before we started the march, there were a number of speakers. And one of them was Giselle speaking the prophetic word of someone who is Black and what their experience is in America and what their experience is when they see George Floyd on television being murdered. So again, when your breath or the spirit of the Lord comes out of you, it creates light or fruit. And in your ministry, in your mission to the community, there's many ways that it produces fruit, but I will just list one. Is there was a mother who was white who in this last year, in this time in our country in Holland, had felt convicted that she needed to serve or would be good to serve and to reach out and to go outside of their comfort zone. And she brought her 3 children to the food distribution to help serve and pass out food. And this was the place where she felt comfortable, where she felt called into reconciliation. And we saw fruit in that. There was another couple that I talked to that lived in the neighborhood, a biracial couple that was getting food, and they told me that they had started coming to the church and were even serving. And there was a family, a Hispanic family, that they went through and they got their food. And after the mother had taken the children to their car, the young boy came out and looked up at Henry Cherry and said, "Thank you," in his sweet voice. So a question going forward is, amidst everything that feels chaotic in our world, at Maple Avenue, within us, so internally in the broader society, how can Maple Avenue live wholeheartedly? How can they have a healed spirit amidst the chaos and continue to bring your prophetic voice and reconciliation?
Maple Avenue refers to itself as a family, or the mamily rather, and as peacemakers, it's not that your family is without conflicts, but rather conflict becomes a peacemaking activity. Here's what one of you said about conflict at Maple Avenue. In conflict, the honest feeling comes out, and that wouldn't have happened in my past experience of congregations where it's just better to be nice. It feels very real and honest and necessary. This is another one of your 3 C's: committed to reconciliation, committed to peace. So as peacemakers, the peace given to us through Christ matters to you. I've seen the way you pass the peace on Sunday mornings. That time is almost as long as my entire church service at my church. It goes on for 15, 20 minutes, and it's great. It's really, really unique and special. You're also peacemakers on a denominational level, a union church, joining both the RCA and CRC, historical division, made one at Maple Avenue, giving new life to that. You're raising up young ones to be peacemakers. We heard about the Freedom Fighters book group led by Pastor Denise, raising up young ones to learn how to be those who can bring peace on earth. And as a multi-ethnic community, you're making peace between different people. Here's what one of you said about this. I always sense God's presence in biracial harmony in American life. I always think God is present in such things because they are so unusual. And as you're called to the core city, you've caught the peacemaking vision of Isaiah, who says they will rebuild the ancient ruins and restore the places long devastated. They will renew the ruined cities that have been devastated for generations. So here's a question moving forward. How does conflict live at Maple Avenue as a way towards peace? How does Maple Avenue Ministries' authenticity cultivate peace, even amidst the discomfort of honesty?
All right. And then, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. You can see at the bottom of the slide, there's a quote from a commentary. And I think this is helpful to frame what being persecuted for righteousness' sake can include. So I'm going to read this. It says, extending mercy, being pure in heart, and working for peace are among the marks of the righteousness for which one is seen as suffering here. It marks fidelity to God despite all kinds of pressure. Because Maple Avenue is a diverse church, and several people emphasized that when they said diverse about Maple Avenue, they didn't just mean racially diverse, but they also meant diverse in terms of age and socioeconomic status, that there's just a lot of diversity within the church community. But because Maple Avenue is diverse and is a church that is committed to social justice and to the work of anti-racism, Maple Avenue experiences the harms of racism firsthand. The Black and Brown members of the church family experience those harms personally. Equality and dignity are righteous causes, and the denial of them is persecution for righteousness' sake. And then we heard a quote. Someone quoted one of your matriarchs at, I guess she didn't quote her, but just referred to her, saying that one of the older matriarchs, she's a prayer warrior, she's very spiritual, and they said she challenges the church to see how racism shows up, even if they think it's not their problem. So Maple Avenue is learning that everyone is impacted by this, even the ones who don't personally experience it. So as Maple Avenue, a socially justice-oriented, diverse church within Holland, Michigan, as you take a clear stand for righteous causes like anti-racism work, you as a church experience the ill effects of political polarization within the culture and within the church world and the religious world in Holland. And then you also experience spiritual pressure and resistance. So I want to highlight again the last part of that quote from the commentary that says, this is marked by fidelity to God despite all kinds of pressure. And that really resonated with me based on what we heard from interviews, is that Maple Avenue does face many pressures, the financial pressures with challenges with the building, also the pressures of experiencing and grieving racism and other social ills, and yet you have remained faithful in the midst of this experience of pressure. Maple Avenue ministers to those who experience persecution for righteousness' sake. There is just a commitment to this idea that social justice is a gospel issue. So there's a commitment to coming alongside those who are downtrodden, who are experiencing harm or persecution. This has been brought up already, but I would say that the response to the Flint water crisis is a recent example of this kind of commitment to social justice as a gospel issue. And so a question going forward is, how does the family at Maple Avenue continue to engage as a protective and nurturing parent, as it engages in strong advocacy for the persecuted and soft-hearted for those in need, including with one another? And I'm just going to conclude with a couple last slides here. Back to this mother image that hopefully you've heard some resonances of as we've gone through the Beatitudes. But again, words that we heard throughout our interview that came up a number of times were words like nurture or nurturing, warmth, care, the idea of a meal, relationships, family, belonging. And we heard at one point that Maple Avenue has in the past used the image of a midwife as a descriptive image for the character or role of the church. And we observed with interest and curiosity that perhaps this is part of growth and part of the evolution of the life of Maple Avenue, is a transition from midwife to full-on mother, where the midwife gets to usher in new life, and then it's someone else's problem to deal with all the rest of the mess. But a mother deals with the chaos and the mess and the stress and strain and exhaustion and being stretched thin and mediating conflict and fatigue and all of the things that are involved with that. Seem to be things that characterize Maple Avenue at this stage in its life as a church. And we just want to encourage Maple Avenue to embrace the calling to be this Beatitudes-shaped mother of many that carries the fragrance of Jesus. And so before we get to our questions and conversation time, I would just like to read a blessing, to speak a blessing to you, over you as Maple Avenue Ministries. So I'm going to read that now. And this is the language here is intentional in part to connect to the together, always together saying that we heard a number of times that's important for life at Maple Avenue. As you together experience poverty of spirit and lack of resources, may you know the full abundance of God's kingdom. As you together mourn griefs and losses, both within the family and in the wider community, may you know the comfort of the one who calls you by name. As you together experience powerlessness and choose gentleness, may you know security through the power of God, in whom your inheritance is sure. As you together hunger and thirst for righteousness, may you be filled through intimate connection with the righteous one. As you together show mercy to each other and to the wider community, may you know the mercy of God like rain on thirsty ground. As you together seek God with a pure heart, may you see God's presence among you and around you and in those you seek to love and serve. As you together pursue courageous peacemaking, may you know the protection and care of God as your loving and attentive parent. And when you together experience persecution for righteousness' sake, or when people revile you or slander you on Christ's account, may you rejoice and be glad, knowing that the treasures of God's kingdom belong to you and that you are following in the footsteps of the prophets who were before you. And the final slide is simply a recap of all the questions. And that is there primarily so that if you want to take a screenshot of this slide, we realized that those questions were interspersed throughout the presentation, but they might be helpful to come back to at some point. So here they are all in one place. And now I am going to stop sharing my screen and we can transition to a time